AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers. And today I have an amazing guest in many regards. Mark Lowenthal is a prolific author and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's written 6 books and over 90 articles on a wide variety of topics involving intelligence and national security affairs. During his CIA career, he was a senior analyst and rose to be the assistant director for analysis and production. He was also the vice chairman for evaluation of the NIC. He had an earlier tour as an office director at State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And perhaps most interesting for a former intelligence officer, he appeared 5 times on Jeopardy and actually won the champions competition in 1988. And has written a book about it. Mark has a brand new book out, Vigilance is Not Enough. It is a wide-ranging history of U.S. intelligence from the revolution to modern day. Mark, welcome to AFIO Now.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me on.
Mark, this is such a comprehensive study. Tell our audience just a little bit about your resources and your method of research.
Sure. Well, the book covers 270 years, so I realized I was not going to research the whole book at one time. So I decided the only sane way to do this was to do it chapter by chapter, do the research, write that chapter, move on. So that's basically what I did. When you get towards a more modern period, a lot of memoirs, which I cannot recommend to you. Presidential memoirs are in very, very bleak. Secretary of State memoirs are really bad, most of them, except for Dean Acheson's, which is, of course, great. And then when you get to the modern period, a lot of documents have been published. And so that was kind of easy. And so I did it chapter by chapter, and happily the security people agreed to review it chapter by chapter, which saved a lot of work. And so I got back the early chapters, the Revolution, the Civil War, really, really fast. And I said to them, I assume this will slow down when we get to the modern era. And they said, count on it. So it was chapter by chapter, and that worked. It was just too big to do all at one time. And also, if I did each chapter, I had a better sense of where I needed to go in the next chapter, even though it's chronological. What are the themes that you want to keep developing? So that's how I did it.
Great explanation. Mark, describe the importance of intelligence officers' access to key policymakers. Which presidents were the most accessible and which were not?
Well, as intelligence officers, we're all aware of the fact that you need access to policymakers. When I got to the modern period, meaning 1947 on, from the creation of the CIA and the NSC on, it becomes so obvious that if you don't have access to the senior officials, and not just the president, the secretaries, the undersecretaries, if you don't have access to them, then nothing else matters. When I was on the staff of the Intelligence Committee, I spent some time with Richard Helms, which was fascinating. And I remember he said to me one time, he said, my authority was directly related to the perception that I could see the president when I needed to see him. And I thought that was really interesting. And so the intel officers, if you don't have access, nothing matters. But you have to remember the policymakers are controlling the access. How amenable are they to interacting with the intelligence officers? And
what are some good examples of good access? And what was the outcome?
Well, Truman, after the Korean War, that was sort of an epiphany for him. Eisenhower obviously had a very close relationship with Allen Dulles. They saw each other at least weekly. President Ford was very accessible. Obviously, Ronald Reagan was accessible, although his relationship with Casey was probably not as close as Casey wanted people to believe. Obviously, Bush 41, having been the director of Central Intelligence, was accessible. His son was accessible. His son was the person who insisted that the director be at the morning briefing every day, which became standard. Obama and Biden were both accessible. And on the other side, we have Kennedy was not terribly accessible, somewhat with McCone. Johnson was not accessible. In fact, when Rayburn was hired to replace McCone, who had quit in frustration over lack of access, Johnson said to Rayburn, Now, I don't want you tugging on my coattails like John McCone. If I need to talk to you, I'll call you. And he never called. And Rayburn quit after 14 months. Helms had access with Johnson at the Tuesday lunch. There was a famous Tuesday lunch. Nixon, Kissinger cut out all the intelligence officers from access to Nixon. Brzezinski did the same thing under Carter, and Turner and Carter never quite got on. Clinton was not that interested in intelligence. It just, for whatever reason, it didn't grab him. And obviously Trump did not allow a lot of access. So again, but this depends on the president, and also depends on their senior officials. How much access do they feel they want or need?
Which U.S. military commanders, starting with Washington, were the best users of intelligence?
Washington was really good. In fact, I argue in the book that he might have been better as an intelligence officer than a commander, although he understood his job was to keep the army in the field. As long as the army was in the field, the revolution was alive. But he understood that you need to collate intelligence. You have to put all the pieces together and ask yourself, what is this telling you or not telling you? He was also very good at deception operations, which he used in Boston after the disaster in Brooklyn, before Trenton and Princeton, on the march to Yorktown. So I would say he was one of the best, actually. And there's this quote, it's in the Spy Museum. It's from Major Beckworth, who was the senior British intelligence officer. He didn't outfight us, he outspied us. Well, yes, but that's part of the game. In the Civil War, Grant, I'm very fond of Grant. Grant used intelligence to form a picture of what was in front of him, and then went ahead and did it. There's this wonderful quote from Sherman, who obviously was very close to Grant, saying, "I know more than Grant about tactics, strategy, logistics, transportation. I'm smarter than Grant. But where Grant beats me and where Grant beats the world is once he gets a picture in his mind of what he wants to do, he goes ahead and does it, and he's very successful." And that was Grant. Sherman was very good at using intelligence. Jackson was good. Lee was very old school. Lee, I don't think was that good at it. He wasn't interested in maps. He was basically relied on cavalry and on personal reconnaissance of the battlefield, which he'd been successful at doing in Mexico. But he really didn't have the same feel for it. And this is also the Union Army at the Potomac created the Bureau of Military Information, not intelligence. And they also understood collating all the pieces together. And there's this story that after the second day at Gettysburg, Meade considered withdrawing, and the BMI told him, "As far as we can tell, sir, Lee has one fresh division left." And so Meade stood, and that fresh division was Pickett's, which the next day ran into a disaster crossing the field. In the second, we can skip the First World War, which we basically relied on the British and the French. In the Second World War, Eisenhower understood the importance of ultra. And so did Patton was very good, a very avid user of ultra. Bradley, a bit later, came to ultra. Mark Clark, a bit later. Nimitz obviously had tremendous faith in his intelligence officers. All the decisions leading up to Midway were because he agreed with Commander Roche, which that's a kind of gutsy move to put everything on. And when the battle was over, he kidded Roche. He said, "You were off by 5 minutes, 5 miles, and 5 degrees," which is pretty good. MacArthur, the ego gets in the way. MacArthur wanted intelligence that agreed with him, basically, is what it comes down to. And none of them were very enthusiastic about OSS. MacArthur and Nimitz had no use for it. Mark Clark a little bit. In Vietnam, intelligence didn't matter a lot, and Helms understood this. Helms understood that they were going to do what they wanted to do regardless of the intelligence he gave them. And during the Gulf Wars, obviously tactical intelligence was very important. The efficiency of those campaigns was due to close intelligence support, although Schwarzkopf also disliked intelligence that questioned his preferred outcomes. So again, this varies with the individual. So it's kind of interesting. But some of them, Grant, Washington, the commanders in World War II, were very, very good at it.
Describe Secretary Stimson's closure of the Black Chamber and his famous quote.
This was really interesting. So there's this famous story that it's true that when Stimson became Secretary of State in 1929, he found out there was this code-breaking unit run by Herbert Yardley, which was not called the Black Chamber until Yardley wrote his book. And Stimson shut it down. And so the quote that's associated with this event was Stimson saying, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail." He didn't say it at the time. He said it 19 years later in his memoirs. But it has all been sort of extrapolated backwards. In fact, Mac Bundy, who helped Stimson write his memoirs, said, "No, this did not happen in 1929. but that was how Stimson felt about it. And there's this interesting sort of after story. So in 1940, Stimson became Secretary of War for the second time. He was Secretary of War under Taft. Roosevelt was running for a third term. He wanted to bring Republicans into the cabinet. And the Army cryptographers had broken the Japanese Purple Code. And they were, oh gosh, Stimson's the secretary. What are we going to do? And so they went to the White House to see Pa Watson, who was Roosevelt's appointment secretary. He was a two-star. And Watson said, well, don't tell the secretary, which is kind of interesting advice from the White House. So they went back to the War Department and they gave a demonstration for General Marshall, the Chief of Staff. He said, this is great. You got to show this to the secretary. So they showed it to, now you're stuck. So they did a demonstration for Stimson. He said, this is wonderful. We are lucky to have such wonderful people and such wonderful successes. So clearly it had to do with where he was sitting at the time. For the Secretary of State, this was not allowable. For the Secretary of War, it was. But the quote is not contemporaneous with the event, which I thought was very interesting.
Why did President Eisenhower Allen Dulles on, even after many reports of major issues?
Yeah, this to me was the great unsolved mystery of the book, Jim. Eisenhower was told repeatedly over the 8 years, Allen Dulles is not up to the job. Not only is he not overseeing the intelligence community, he's not even running the CIA. He's running what was then called the DDP, now the DDO. And yet Eisenhower kept him on. And I mean, there are more studies of how intelligence is functioning under Eisenhower than under any other president, which suggests that things were not going that well. And Eisenhower during the war would sack 2 stars and 3 stars who he felt were not performing up to grade. He was fairly vigorous about that. And yet he kept Dulles on. And there's this famous quote from Eisenhower, I'd rather have Allen Dulles with all of his shortcomings as my intelligence officer than anyone else. And I can't figure it out. And I don't think it had to do with the fact that John Foster Dulles was his brother, was the Secretary of State. I think Dulles was very good in the meeting. He was very glib. He's a good presenter. And for whatever reason, Eisenhower just decided to ignore all this other advice from people he respected, Jimmy Doolittle and Kelly and all these other people. And I've never solved that one. That's, as I said, that's the one great mystery in the book to me.
Mark, in your view, what were some of CIA's greatest successes, but also biggest failures?
Sure. I think the first major covert action in the Italian election that James Angleton ran in Italy was a tremendous success, and it showed that this worked. I think the coup in 1953 in Iran was a success, but you can get a lot of debate about this, as you know. The creation of the U-2 was an amazing success, which belongs to Kelly Johnson Lockheed. The creation of the first imagery satellites, and it took, I think it's satellite number 12 or 13 that finally worked end to end. Now, can you imagine today going up to the Hill and saying, now, Senator, I know we've had 12 failures, but I'm feeling really lucky. But people understood this really is rocket science. I mean, literally rocket science. And there was a great deal of forgiveness for failure. The Cuban Missile Crisis ends as a success, but it begins as a failure. There's this famous special NIE that Sherman Kent oversaw. What is Khrushchev going to do? And the fourth case D, was putting missiles in Cuba. He would never do that. He'd have to know how disruptive that would be. He would never do that. In fact, it's funny, after the crisis was over, Kent said, we couldn't believe Khrushchev could make a mistake like that. So in other words, the estimate was right and Khrushchev was wrong. But clearly, once they recognized what was happening, very successful intelligence for the president, the use of Oleg Penkovsky's intelligence in Moscow, which starts out as a failure, was we blew him off initially, and he went to see the Brits instead. Dick Kerr, did a study of all of the intelligence on the Soviet Union once the Cold War was over, and Dick came to an interesting conclusion. He said, but keeping a very varied set of policymakers, from Truman to Bush 41, well informed, and avoiding major crises with the Soviet Union, except for 1 or 2 times, we did a pretty good job. And that to me is an interesting reflection. I think we were good on the collapse of the Soviet Union. We saw it coming. Nobody could call the date, but then again, neither could the KGB. But I think we had a really good sense at a certain point, this is unraveling. And the only question is, does it go down peacefully? Does it go down ugly? I think our campaign against terrorists after 9/11 has been very successful. Now, we get into issues about rendition and interrogation, but I think in terms of preventing terrorist attacks in the United States, we've been successful. Operation Neptune Spear, the operation that killed bin Laden, was a tremendous intelligence success. And obviously, the use of intelligence at the onset of the Ukraine war by Bill Burns in trying to warn Putin, but also in getting the EU and NATO to back what President Biden wanted to do, I think was a tremendous success in the use of intelligence, what they called intelligence diplomacy. I mean, it's not that new, but the fact that they did it successfully. In fact, I'll tell you an interesting anecdote. The NSA has published the history of NSA during the Cold War, which I also cannot recommend to you as literature. But there's this funny quote in the chapter on Reagan saying, the Reagan administration seemed to want to use intelligence to further its foreign policy goals. I thought that was the point. But that's the, no, we just created this for our own sake. So those, I think, were some of the successes. Some of the failures, the early paramilitary ops against the Soviet Union, trying to create rebellions, was a failure. Lucian Truscott, general, was brought in to advise on, we were dropping people into Ukraine and Russia. And he said, the only thing they're proving is the law of gravity. This was just not a tremendous success. Obviously, the illicit drug testing program was worse than a failure. It was criminal. For some reason, Wisner and Dulles decided they needed to have a coup in Indonesia for no apparent reason whatsoever. And it was a failure. And it also tells you a lot about how Wisner and Dulles ran the DDP. The Bay of Pigs clearly was a failure. It was a bad plan that Kennedy made worse. But everybody involved in that is culpable. The CIA, the JCS, the White House. Iran-Contra, I mean, the problem begins at the NSC staff, but then it flows into the CIA as well. Dealing with the losses in Moscow that ended up being the fault of Aldrich Ames was a major failure. In not pursuing it more avidly to figure out why are we losing these people, in not keeping Congress informed. And obviously the Iraq estimate, for which I bear some responsibility, was not our finest moment of analysis. So, it's, as you know, and as people in AFIO know, this is a difficult business. And you're going to get some right and you get some wrong. The trouble is people remember the ones you got wrong, especially policymakers. They will come back to you and say, so that's sort of a fast list of some of the successes and failures of the agency, I think.
Yeah, some of the best stories have never been told, and often for good reason, but almost always the compromises that get told.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I was writing about the famous The Year of the Spy in 1985, when we had Pollard and the Walker family and Yurchenko, that was a bad year. But you can't see the other side of the ledger. How many people did we have operating on our side? You're not going to know that. So it becomes an unbalanced story in a way.
I can't let you go without asking you a question about Jeopardy. So you appeared 5 times on the program. You won the Champions Award. You've written a book on the subject. Give our audience some background insight into what it was like to appear on Jeopardy.
Sure.
What was it like behind the scenes?
First of all, remember, everybody on Jeopardy is self-selected. They're wise guys. You're sitting at home saying, I can do that. And so you apply online. When I did it, it was different. And you fly out there on your own dime if you're accepted. And when I played, you won 5 games and you were retired. They changed that so now you can run as long as you can. Ken Jennings, who's a wonderful guy, set the record. The set has changed. When I first went out, the set was a mess. I mean, it was masking. It was just held together. What's interesting is security. This will be interesting to AFIO folks. Security on the Jeopardy set is really, really good. There's the contestant staff and there's the game show staff, and they never meet. And what happens is somebody from the network comes down, and there are all these little discs. There's like 7 discs. They tape 5 shows in a day, which you don't realize at home. But if you're winning, you run upstairs, you change your clothes, you go downstairs, you play again. You get really tired. And so this guy from standards and practices says, that one. So nobody knows which game's going to come up until the board comes on. And you don't know what you walk out on the set and you go, oh, God. You look at the categories and realize I remember I was playing in a quarterfinal match in the tournament, and one of the topics was sewing. I don't do a lot of sewing. My wife does. And I listen sometimes. And I turned to this woman I was playing against, Leah Greenwald, and she's very wealthy. And I said, do you know anything about sewing? She said, yes. And so one of the issues is timing. You can't press your button until Ken, in those days Alex, says the last syllable of the last word. If you press sooner than that, your system shuts down for, I think it's like 0.2 seconds, which is the end of the world. And they did that because in the earlier iteration of the show, you could press in as soon as you knew it. And the trouble is the people on stage were faster than the home audience, and the home audience didn't know what the questions were. And so they slowed the game down. So you also have to get, till the end of my days, Jim, I can hear Alex's rhythm in my head. Da, 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 da. And so you have to get this rhythm down. The contestant staffs, they're wonderful people. Some of them are still there. I mean, this was years ago, and they're still there. The contestants are an odd lot. They're all these strange people who said, I can go out there and play this game. It's very strange. What's really interesting is people will recognize you on the street, which I thought was just strange. I don't know why, but when I won the championship, it was in November. And in December, I was in INR at the time, and we went to Australia for a meeting, and my wife and daughter came along with me. We were going to have a vacation afterwards. We were sitting on this catamaran on the Great Barrier Reef, and I know what I sound like. I have a raspy voice. And this woman hears my voice and goes, "You were on Jeopardy!" I thought, oh God, we're 10,000 miles from home on a catamaran. And my wife said, "I'll take the kid. You talk to the lady." I mean, I just thought that was so strange. It's an interesting experience. Like I said, it just, you sort of decide, I'm willing to risk embarrassment in front of 25, 30 million people. One last story. Alex was obsessed with U.S. intelligence. Alex was Canadian by birth. He was a U.S. citizen. And all he wanted to talk about during those interview sections was intelligence. And I wanted to blow my security clearance in front of 25 million people. So finally I said to the staff, "Could we get him to talk about something else, please?" And they said, "Why?" I said, "Let's talk about books. Let's talk about books I've written." They said, "Fine." But Alex understood that he wasn't the star of the show. The star of the show were those three people. And when he died, and he really died when it was a public service and talking to people about his cancer, the game show staff forgot that. And they started doing all these strange tryouts and things. And they finally made the only choice that was obvious, which was Ken Jennings. But Alex understood that. And he was the host, which is how he was introduced, which I thought was very interesting. So that's some of the behind-the-scenes Jeopardies.
Great story. Thanks. Well, the name of the book is Vigilance is Not Enough. And I want to thank Mark Lowenthal for a great interview on AFIO Now.
Jim, thank you for the opportunity.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.